All right, looking at the matter of standing in the Lord, the challenges to stand in the Lord on page 113. And one of the things, there are several things we want that need to be discussed in the matter of standing in the Lord, or actually I would say standing for the Lord, although they're not the exact same thing, but you can't do one without the other. And the first one is to acknowledge the divine doctrines regarding the Lord's church. The divine doctrines regarding the Lord's church. There are a number of things, doctrines, from the New Testament, that mark the Lord's church as being different than every other religious body. And that is the means by which we can know or identify the Lord's church, the church revealed to us in the New Testament. And the one thing I think needs to be remembered first is that these doctrines do not originate with men. These are, as the book says, they're divine doctrines. In other words, these are the things that God has said. And as being those things which God has said, they must be regarded as holy. They must be regarded as necessary, and they must be regarded as. I know that sacred is the same idea as holy, but I mean by that it's something that has to be protected, and so. And I thought about, for example, there are four, let's just think for a moment, there are four things that four general ideas or four general areas wherein God has given divine doctrines for the church. And the first is the matter of salvation. In other words, what does God teach us in His Word about the matter of salvation? And generally speaking, that will be the first and foremost line of separation between the Lord's church and most every other religious institution on the planet. Now, you'll find what I mean by salvation, I'm speaking specifically about the matter of baptism. And although you will find in some independent Christian churches, you'll find that there is still a strong adherence to the doctrine of baptism. If you've been here on Wednesday nights, you've been listening to Kyle. He's been using a book, especially when he's teaching from Acts 2 and 3, written by a man by the name of Jack Cottrell. Now, Cottrell is a scholar by every measure, and he has written some great books that have benefited me. In fact, I think I gave Kyle the books that he has been using. But he's written some great books on baptism, and he's written some great books on Calvinism. And yet he's still a member of the independent Christian church. So, in other words, there are some doctrines about the church that he does not hold. For example, with regard to worship. But I just simply say that to say that there are still members of what might be considered the conservative independent Christian church that still hold to baptism. There are pockets of Baptist churches that hold the Bible doctrine of baptism. By and large, they're not not particularly well known, but there are some, and you're going to find will be some community churches that hold the doctrine of baptism, and I've run across some of those in my studies and research, But these things that the Bible teaches are from God and have to be understood as being from God and defended, believed and defended as being from God. Another aspect of the church is the matter of church organization. God established His church, and God gave word on how the church is supposed to be organized. And any deviation from that is to deviate from the divine doctrine of the Bible with regard to the church. In other words, anything with regard to church organization that cannot be found in the Scriptures is a deviation from divine doctrine. and needs to be understood as such and needs to be opposed as such. Then you can go to the doctrine of worship. And again, there are two primary doctrines of worship that generally separate the Lord's church from other religious institutions, one being the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, and the second being the absence of instrumental music or special type music, what I would refer to as performance worship. And so those things would make the church different. And again, these are not things that we believe just to be different. These are things we believe because God has given them to us. The doctrine of apostasy is another doctrine that wouldn't separate us so much from as many religious institutions or groups, but certainly the doctrine of the possibility of apostasy would be one of those things. And so, in other words, these things have to be acknowledged. We cannot act like these things do not exist. And then letter B on page 113 says, there is the challenge for members of the Church of Christ to acquire the distinctive character of those belonging to the Lord's church. Now, I think this is an important point. This is something, by the way, this is something that is different from what we just talked about. What we just talked about are the biblical or the divine doctrines that God has given for the church as an institution. And I know J. Ridley Stroop would probably roll over in his grave if he heard me say that. If you remember, we studied two of Stroop's books, and he hated the idea of the church as an institution, but I think it's appropriate to use it in the sense in which we're using it. But in other words, there are structural things that God has given for the church in every place. The local church, the universal church, in every place. What is under discussion here is the distinctive nature and character of those who constitute the Lord's church. Now, there are some things that I think that need to be considered. And one is and I don't know if you've ever thought about this. It's not an excuse to not do it, but I don't know if anybody's ever thought about this. It is more difficult for us to be distinct today than it was for the church in the first century to be distinct. And the reason for that is there were no religious institutions like the church in the first century. As Jimmy and I talk about the sect. Jimmy will refer to the church as the sect, which simply means the group, a different group. And it, by the way, that term's biblical in the sense that the church is called the sect, which is everywhere spoken against. And so we use that term in kind of a joking way, but it's still, the Bible describes the church in those terms. But there was nothing in the days of the first century that remotely resembled the church. Not even Judaism. Now, there were aspects of Jewish life. There were aspects of Jewish life that resembled Christianity. For example, holy living. Loving your neighbor, specific days or times of worship, and various aspects of worship, prayer. All of those things were in some way related to Christianity, but Christianity was a vastly different religious system than Judaism. All right, so then you go beyond that and look, and I don't know 15 cents, all right, about the first century world. But here's what I do know. I don't read anything in my New Testament that indicates that there was anything like Christianity in the first century. In other words, there was no system of denominationalism. In other words, a person in the first century who professed to being a follower of Jesus Christ did so at his or her own peril. At the risk of being persecuted, at the risk of having all their earthly belongings taken, at the risk of being imprisoned, and at the risk of being killed. So anybody that was bold enough to profess to follow Jesus Christ in the days of the first century was, I think it would be safe to say, was a genuine believer in basically every sense of the word. All right? Those things didn't exist in the first century. But now what do we have? Literally thousands of religious institutions all paying lip service and to some degree life service to the idea that Christ has called his people to a higher way of living. All right? What are you going to say, Johnny? Yeah.
The general kindness toward man on the Christian part.
Right.
Just general kindness to whoever. But that didn't exist. From what you see, that apparently didn't exist.
Well, it was supposed to exist, but it didn't exist in large degree. Right. And
you look to others, look to the needs of others. Evidently, that didn't go on.
It was problematic in its practice, but it was supposed to be a part of Judaism, taking in strangers, right. All those types of things. But yeah, but the presence of Christianity was a radical change to every other religious system that was on the earth. So that's why I say it's more difficult for people to be distinct today than it was in the days of the first century. But that does not mean that it is impossible for us to be distinct. Again, I think as a general rule that any person who lives faithfully to the precepts that are found for Christians in the New Testament will of necessity be different than even other devout religious individuals who profess some form of Christianity. Look, we all know somebody whose grandma's a good person, right? We all know somebody whose granny read her Bible every day. We all know somebody whose granny cooked chicken soup for people that were sick. But again, if one adheres to all the tenets of Christianity as revealed in the New Testament, that person will be different. Now, I don't want to go too far into this because, Lord willing, in about 45 minutes or an hour, I'm fixing to preach to this effect. So I don't want to give away too much of my sermon to deal with this. But think about this. Even those devout religious people hold ideas that we would consider as being inconsistent with Christianity. For example, will they lay out services to go to decoration? Now, question: is that an acceptable thing for a Christian to do, to forsake the assembly, to go, as Ronnie Hayes used to say, go have a picnic with the dead? Well, no, that's not consistent with, but, so you see what I'm saying? In their minds, though, they would still practice such a thing. Or might even go, let's just say they're a member of denomination A, they might even go and attend at denomination B, which is a completely separate faith system, in order to go to the decoration at denomination B. And that's not acceptable for any child of God. And so what I'm saying is, if we were to be consistent in our practice of New Testament Christianity, we would be distinct from every other religious institution, because all those institutions hold some things or don't hold some things, either hold or don't hold some things in a way that is consistent with the teaching of the New Testament. Now, to that, let me say this. A good friend of mine, Brandon Edwards, man, I don't know how old Brandon's probably in his mid-30s. I'm not certain. But Brandon's a really smart and a really thoughtful guy. I think he's the grandson, if you know anything about Freed Hardman, he's the grandson of Earl Edwards, who oversaw the Bible department for years and years. But Brandon made a statement last year, and I'm glad he reposted it. I guess it came up in his memories on Facebook from last year, and he posted it again. And he said, my fear is for the church is that we have bought into the idea that there is such a thing as an average Christian. An average Christian. In other words, to buy into the idea that I'm just an average Christian means that I'm satisfied with acceptable. I found a level of acceptance in my own mind as to where I am, and I'm happy with that, which means I'm not going to what? I'm not going to try to get any better. In other words, the idea that there is such a thing as an average Christian, first of all, poisons the mind of the Christian. All right? Secondly, it treats Christianity as if it's something that everybody can do. In other words, I might say, well, I'm an average swimmer. Look, I understand that not everything will work, but I'm an average runner. I'm an average swimmer. I'm an average rummy player. I'm an average gardener. Just fill in the blank. In other words, what I'm saying is that just about anybody with just a little bit of effort can be just as good a gardener as I can. What's that? Yeah, I'm an average bomb technician. But we say, well, so what are we saying? When we think about the idea of the average Christian, we say, well, just about anybody with just a minimal amount of effort can be what I am. So first of all, what does that say about what you are? Or what you consider yourself to be? And what does it say about our attitude toward what it means to be a Christian? Now look, can anybody be a Christian? Johnny? Yes. Anybody can be a Christian. Doesn't the Bible teach that everybody should be a Christian? It does. But does that mean that anybody with minimal effort can be a Christian?
They don't completely die to self.
They don't what?
Completely die to self.
I heard you the first time. I just wanted you to say it louder for the people in the back.
Yeah. They're still holding on to something.
Yeah, they haven't died to self. Nobody can be a Christian until they're willing to die to self.
That's really, really hard because
really,
everybody, because everybody, I mean everybody holds on to some root, some little bit, they won't turn loose.
It's difficult to completely turn loose of everything, isn't it?
Yeah. Answer to that: hold them under just a little bit longer.
Hold them under.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get it.
That's the only way that you're going to get rid of it.
That's right. Yeah, it's got to die. It's got to die. And we have to, as you said, it's difficult to die to self. And so while anybody can be a Christian, certainly not everybody's going to be a Christian. Number one, because it is a difficult thing to be a Christian. Look, and I know what Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But I think contextually speaking, I think Jesus is first of all, I think there's some contrast between the burdens that the Jews placed on the people, the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership placed upon the people, as opposed to how Jesus placed it upon the people. Note, he said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me." And so Jesus, first of all, says it's a voluntary thing. And it is an easy thing only when one considers the reward for such. In other words, it is difficult, for you guys. Well, I'm using Mason for an example. Mason played football, and he's an offensive lineman. Not a lot of glory in the offensive line. I mean, nobody knows the names of the offensive linemen, except for the parents and the grandparents. But everybody knows the name of the quarterback. Everybody knows the name of the running back. And yet it's difficult to prepare week in and week out to play a game of football, even at the high school level, if it's done right. But you do it because you want to walk off the field Friday night and sing the alma mater as a winner. Is that right? And you consider, again, I'm talking directly to Mason. You consider that the idea of walking off the field as a winner is worth whatever effort you put into Monday through Thursday afternoon. Isn't that right? So, as we think about Christianity, which obviously has an infinitely greater reward, the difficulties associated with the Christian life are indeed light. As Paul said, for our light affliction, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, our light affliction, which is a burden, it's a persecution, says, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal way to glory. So Paul's not minimizing the persecution. He's not minimizing the difficulty. He's not minimizing the tribulation. He's saying that whatever it is that we endure in order to be a faithful child of God is going to be worth it far more in the end. And so therefore it makes it easy when we have a proper mindset about the end result. And so, yes, there is the sense in which the Bible speaks of it being a light affliction in that sense. But we all still understand it's difficult. It's difficult. And the idea that somehow we've conjured up that there is such a thing as an average Christian speaks far more about us than it does about what the Bible says in regard to being a Christian. Anybody can do it. But no one can do it without diligence and discipline. Does that make sense? Anybody can do it, but nobody can do it without diligence, difficulty, and discipline. All right, then letter C. Yeah, letter C. I've written all over this thing, so I'm making sure at the bottom of page 113. There is a challenge for the members of the Church of Christ to protect the Church of Christ. And the scripture reference there is Ephesians 5, beginning in verse 25, which should in our minds immediately take us to the bride of Christ. The husband and the wife, Christ and the church. On page 113, we have been provided with the necessary armor that must be worn by the Christian in order to access this supply of strength. In other words, it's talking about the need to protect the church, to protect the bride of Christ. Now, I'm not gonna ask for a show of hands because it's really not important. But I suspect that most of us have a firearm in our house. Right? Most of us. Now, whether you do or don't is not relevant. All right? I've got one real close to my bedstand. Now, why do I have a firearm real close to my bedstand, my nightstand? What?
Easy access, quick access.
Quick access, but what's its purpose? For protection. To protect who? And who am I primarily protecting at my house right now? But one person in particular, Rhonda. You know, at one time it was Rhonda and Shelby and Jeffrey. All right, and now with them gone, now it's Rhonda. Now, do you think I would hesitate for one moment to kill somebody that I thought was going to hurt my wife? Because if you think so, you thought wrong. Because I'm willing to go to whatever lengths are necessary to protect my wife. Right? And it's my opinion that any husband who wouldn't ain't worth his salt. Now, I'm not saying you got to shoot somebody. I'm just saying you got to be willing to do whatever it takes to protect your wife. All right? So, by the way, I got accosted by a member of the church in Winston County for saying that one time, talking about what I'd do to somebody that tried to hurt my wife. And I didn't tolerate that foolishness very long. But now, I'm glad Dennis stepped out, because when I started talking about guns, Dennis' ears perked up, you see. Now, Dennis and I have had this conversation many a time. Dennis, you ever sit with your back to the door at the restaurant?
No.
Never. Dennis never sits with his back to the door at the restaurant. Why, Dennis?
Situational awareness.
Situational awareness. In other words, if something goes down, you don't want to be the last to find out. You want to be the first. Right? Keep your eye on the door. Right. You ever keep your eye on somebody that looks sketchy in a restaurant?
Yes.
All right, you do. Why?
Possible threat.
All right, do you think about what you might do if said sketchy person starts acting a little bit crazy?
Yes.
Me too. Johnny? You? Dwayne? Toby? Stick a fork in her ear. Whatever I got at hand.
I even do it on an airplane, especially on an airplane.
On an airplane.
I look at to see who looks suspicious.
You're a profiler, Lisa.
And what I would do. Yeah,
By the way, all right, to Lisa's point, Bill Burke and I sat in the airport in Nairobi, Kenya one time trying to get home. And 5 Muslim imams came in and sat down about 2 seats over from us. Now, do you think it made me nervous? You better believe it, because they'd just blown up a shopping mall over there. You know, killed about 50, or no, they blew up a hotel and they shot up a shopping mall. I'm not saying those guys did it. Some of their representatives possibly did. It made me nervous. But I didn't have a choice. I had to get on the airplane if I wanted to get home, right? So don't think I'm not watching. But what's my point? My point is, we all, as a general rule, we all try to be aware, especially in today's society. We all try to be aware, should be aware of potential dangers, right? And have at least some kind of plan in our mind as to what we would try to do given a certain situation. And we try to prepare ourselves for that, right? Now, what about the church? Because see, I've spent all this time building up in our minds, because I've yanked your emotions around a little bit, talking about protecting your wife and kids, right? And all the thought that goes into it, and the preparation that goes into it, and the planning that goes into it, and the awareness that goes into it. But what about the church? Do you think about protecting the church? Do you think of, do you have a plan? For example, if I'm going to go somewhere, and look, I've been blessed all my life obviously my dad's family, they were not members of the church, and we spent time there. But almost all my family gatherings, my family reunion is just filled with members of the church. And we can sit down and we can talk about football, or we can talk about baseball, or we can talk about gardening, or we can talk about the Bible, right? And that's a blessing. But what if I was the only member of the church in my family? And every single family gathering was going to be basically Todd against the world. Now see, I see John smiling because that's the guy I got in my mind right now. I'm thinking about John because we've had a bunch of conversations over the last 20 years about this very thing. Now the question is, and I'm going to let John answer because this doesn't really apply to me specifically. Have you ever given any thought about what might be brought up at a Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas gathering? 4th of July? Have you ever given any thought before you go about what somebody might say to you about being a Christian?
Well, they all profess that. They all profess that. Yet they I lead prayer. I offer the prayer before. I've talked to several of them, and they pretty much leave me alone.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you stick out. But let me ask you, do they completely leave you alone?
They do not pick on me at all.
Did they?
Did they? At first, they tried to. They actually tried to pull me toward them, but when they seen that I didn't, when they saw that I didn't adhere to anything that they believed, then they shunned me.
All right. Now let's go to step 2. Once that process was handled, that look, I ain't going back. I'm not going with you. I'm not going with you. I'm not going back to this. So now there's this marked line of separation. All right. So, but they didn't just leave you alone completely from right then, did they? I mean, because here's what I'm getting at. Ever hear any Campbellite remarks?
No, really, you'd think that.
I see Lisa nodding her head. And what I mean by that, I don't mean like specifically Campbellite, but anybody ever just with a little single gouge
They
you?
did early on.
Okay, so
But it stopped.
okay. So and why did it stop?
Well, I threw Bible at them. You see what I'm saying? And,
You hear what he said?
And they all, and then
I threw the Bible at him.
And then they all. This is the cool part that I noticed because there's a lot of them, and none of them remember the church. But here's the really cool part. Then I saw them separate from themselves. A little patch one over here, a couple one over here, because they realized they didn't all believe the same thing.
They didn't all believe the same thing. But
I'm the enemy.
Mhm.
I'm the enemy, but now they have.
But do you see? Let's go back to the bride picture, the husband and wife picture. Now to the church picture. What has happened? There was a threat, and the threat was handled. And then there's the poking the bear situation, which also got handled, right? And so now you don't have to deal with that like you did at one time because of all the things we've talked about. The forethought, the planning, the preparation, the study. Because look, I know you well enough to know that you're running scenarios in your mind. If they say this, this is my response. Or, you know what, I heard them say this to somebody else at some other point in time, and if they bring that up again, this is my... In other words, you're not just going in blind, you're going in with a plan and preparation. All right? You have to be able to answer. That's right. You remember I talked a couple weeks ago about Jeffrey being asked a question at work about what does it mean to walk in the light. And I thought he did a great job. You know, for somebody just gets caught right off guard at the lunchroom break room table. He did a great job. But the point is, he'd been preparing for this. In other words, he had been through his study. He had the knowledge. He had the knowledge that he needed. Now, I'm not saying that if somebody had come ready for a debate, he was ready to throw down. But in that setting, he was prepared. So the question is, how are we preparing ourselves to defend the bride of Christ? How much thought do we give to protecting the bride of Christ? How much time or thought do we give to looking at possible scenarios that might affect the bride of Christ? You see, these are all things that we have to think about if we're going to prepare appropriately for them. And so, I was looking at this, at the top of page 114. How do we act when dangers confront the body and bride of Christ? Do we sit silently? Do we rationalize changes that will pollute divine truth? Will we close our eyes and our mouths because we are intimidated by those who are arrogant and boastful in their efforts to change the Lord's church? Now, he's talking about he's talking about Christians that are leaving the faith specifically here. But any of this applies. And then here's what John was getting at. It's number 3. It's top of page 114. Nothing less than a full, vigorous confrontation is acceptable to God. In other words, if you sit silently, nothing is ever going to be resolved. Nothing is ever going to be resolved. And so we have this the requirement to stand for the divine doctrines that define the church, for the lifestyle that marks those who are members of the church, and then the ability to put on the whole armor of God to defend the purity and the integrity of the church.